Dungeon Reaper. A light novel by Bloodmoss. Chapter 16. The Weight You Carry. The wooden door groaned as Cain eased the key into the lock, its sound thin and brittle against the suffocating stillness of the night. A familiar mix of sweat, aged wood, and faint incense drifted out to meet him, curling around his shoulders like an old, worn cloak. Kempo no Numa was quiet at this hour, but not silent. Somewhere deeper in the dojo, the steady thud of fists against padded targets echoed in the distance. Someone was still practicing. Slow, deliberate strikes, long past when they should have stopped. Cain let the sound settle in his ears, the rhythm grounding him in the present, a fragile comfort after the chaos of the dungeon. He lingered in the doorway, shoulder pressed against the cold frame, letting the dull ache in his body pulse in slow waves. It wasn't the sharp pain of injury. He knew that pain, but the deeper, grinding soreness that promised bruises and stiffness by morning. Yet, even that wasn't what weighed him down. The memory crept in uninvited. Silk-wrapped bodies, swaying like grotesque ornaments. Small shapes. Children. Cain's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, the taste of iron lingering as if the air itself was laced with blood. He exhaled slowly and kicked off his boots, stepping further into the dojo. The polished floor reflected the dim overhead lights, stretching his shadow thin and long along the walls. His eyes drifted to the students still moving through their forms, each strike precise, each breath measured. No monsters, no collapsing dungeons, just people pushing themselves, disciplined and steady. For a moment, he envied them. Cain turned away and made his way to the back apartment. The door creaked open under his hand, revealing the sparse living space he now called home. A futon leaned against the far wall, a battered dresser slouched in the corner. The air was cool and still. He loosened his grip on the kusarigama, its cold weight dragging at his arm. Gently, he set it down in the corner, the curved blade catching a sliver of light as the chain coiled like a sleeping serpent. For a weapon meant to bring him closer to power, it felt impossibly heavy now. His bag hit the floor with a dull thud. Cain dropped onto the futon, head tipping back against the wall, staring at the cracked ceiling. The weight in his chest didn't lift. If anything, it sank deeper. His gaze flicked back to the kusarigama. A part of him itched to grab it, to train until his muscles gave out, to swing until the noise in his head dulled to nothing. But his limbs felt leaden, his body betraying him with exhaustion that clung tighter than the aches in his bones. The muffled rhythm of fists against padded targets still echoed faintly through the walls. A calm, predictable cadence. It should have been enough to ground him. But even that steady drumbeat couldn't silence the memory of distant screams. Cain dragged in a slow breath, holding it until his lungs burned, then let it slip out between clenched teeth. Whatever strength he had now, it wasn't enough. Not yet. But he would find a way. Cain knelt in the center of the practice floor, the cold surface biting into his knees. Before him, Shihan Hoshizawa sat, perfectly still, his posture impossibly straight. The dim lighting carved harsh shadows across the lines of his face, making his sharp eyes seem even more severe. "Close your eyes," Hoshizawa instructed, his tone calm but leaving no room for argument. Cain obeyed without hesitation, though his thoughts stirred uneasily. "Empty your mind," he thought bitterly. Sure, because that's ever worked before. Still, he exhaled slowly, doing his best to comply. Hoshizawa's voice softened, but the weight it carried was undeniable. "What I am about to show you is not a shortcut. It is a strain, a burden. But for those willing to shoulder it, progress is exponential." Cain's breath caught. This was what he needed. No hesitation. No questions. Just more. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the anticipation clawing at him. There was a pause, a silence so complete it made Cain's skin prickle. Then Hoshizawa replied, "Very well." Cain didn't see it, but he felt it, a thread being drawn taut between them. The air grew heavier, as if the walls of the dojo were pressing inward. Then it hit. A flood of movement, not his own, but Hoshizawa's. Every kata, every strike, Every defensive form surged into his mind in a brutal, unrelenting torrent. His muscles spasmed as phantom motions tore through him. His arms jerked, his legs twitched, sweat breaking out along his back as if he'd been training for hours. No, for days. Cain's heart pounded in his chest. His mind reeled, struggling to grasp control. Movements he'd never learned carved themselves into his body. Muscle memory without the memory. Yet it wasn't just the movements. Beneath the surface, something else slithered in the link, a sensation like cold fingers brushing the edge of his mind. The shadows cling to you, but why? Hoshizawa's voice drifted into the haze, soft and almost absent-minded. Yet the words sent a chill down Cain's spine. Then it stopped. Cain collapsed forward, catching himself on trembling arms. His breath came in ragged gasps, sweat dripping from his chin onto the wooden floor. The dojo felt too big, too quiet. He looked around. Several of his fellow students sat waiting, their faces evident of frustration and curiosity. How long had they been watching this spectacle? Above him, Hoshizawa stood slowly, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharp and calculating. 14 hours, he said flatly, as if the number were nothing more than a statistic. Acceptable. Cain blinked, barely processing the number. It felt like minutes and days all at once. His muscles screamed, his joints ached, and yet, when he flexed his hands, they responded with a newfound sharpness. Movements felt cleaner, more precise. It worked. Grinning through the exhaustion, Cain pushed himself upright. Let's do it again. Hoshizawa didn't return the smile. He studied Cain with unsettling calm, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, we must. But your mind is not calm enough. You must process. Perhaps tomorrow. His tone was colder now, more distant. Cain didn't notice. But a storm raged behind his instructor's narrowed eyes. Cain slept like a stone, but the restless energy of the dojo stirred him awake. The steady rhythm of strikes echoed through the walls, fists pounding into padded targets, bodies moving through practiced forms. Rising slowly, Cain stretched the stiffness from his limbs, the lingering ache of the mental link gnawing at his muscles. Yet, as he stepped onto the practice floor, his movements felt different, smoother, sharper. His body responded without hesitation, as if his mind and limbs had finally caught up with each other. And people noticed. Not with curiosity or admiration. The eyes that followed him were colder, honed like a blade drawn too many times. Jealousy hung in the air, heavier than the scent of sweat and varnished wood. Fragments of murmured voices slithered through the rhythmic slap of fists meeting flesh. Cain caught enough to understand. Somewhere to his left, a voice muttered, "Must be nice," skipping years of training. Another, quieter but no less bitter, followed. Hoshizawa never gives that kind of attention to anyone. And then, barely above a whisper, shortcutting his way to the top. Cain flexed his fingers, steadying his breath. The weight of their stares pressed against him, but he forced his focus back to his footwork. In his mind, a voice echoed, an older, rougher voice. One that sounded like the crackle of dry leaves in the wind. He could almost see the man it belonged to, a grandfather he had never met, sun-dried and weathered by years of labor. Balance isn't stillness, boy. It's knowing where to step before the ground shifts beneath you. The words rang clear, as if spoken beside him, grounding him more than any practiced form could. His footing adjusted instinctively, grounding his center and relaxing his shoulders. His hands hovered at waist level, open, ready. His breath slowed, matching the steady rhythm of the dojo. Cain's eyes tracked the students sparring around him, reading their movements with startling clarity. A glance downward, a shift in stance, the slight dip of a shoulder, the faint twitch of a knee, small tells that spoke louder than words. Openings blinked into existence, subtle but exploitable. A shadow fell across his vision. Cain blinked, dragged from his thoughts as a tall, broad-shouldered student approached. The student wiped sweat from his brow with deliberate slowness, the faint hum of the dojo dulling as nearby students subtly paused. Eyes shifted toward them, lingering longer than before. Across the room, a student paused mid-strike, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Cain. Taller than most, with a solid frame and a practiced air of confidence, he finished his drill with deliberate precision before handing off his training weapon. His gaze didn't waver as he approached Hoshizawa, his voice low but carrying enough to draw subtle attention. Shihan, if he's ready for all this attention, perhaps he'd be ready for a match. Would it be acceptable if I sparred with your new project? Hoshizawa didn't respond immediately, his arms still folded as his calculating eyes flicked between the two. A slow nod was his only answer. The student turned toward Cain, a polite but tight smile forming as he crossed the floor. His steps were steady, each one echoing faintly in the dojo's stillness. You're with the Hollow Blade Guild, right? Heard they took in a new recruit. Is it true you're only rank E? Cain met his gaze evenly, the question hanging in the air. He could feel the weight behind it, not mockery, but an evaluation. The student tilted his head slightly, his tone still measured but firm. I'm rank D. If that bothers you, say so now. No shame in knowing your limits. Cain's expression didn't waver. His voice was steady. No problem here. I could use the practice. The student's smile tightened, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. Good. Let's see what you've got. A flicker of something meaner sparked behind the student's smile. Without another word, they moved to the sparring mat. The air around them tightened as curious onlookers drifted closer. Cain rolled his shoulders, settling into a balanced stance. No weapons, just fists and footing. At the edge of the room, Hoshizawa watched, arms folded, his gaze fixed on Cain, silent, unmoving. The match began with precise, calculated movement. The student lunged forward, aiming a swift vertical punch at Cain's chest, a textbook strike in Ryukyu Kempo. Cain's eyes flicked to the subtle shift in his opponent's hips, sensing the intention behind the strike. He rotated his body, angling away and guiding the attack past him with a sweeping parry of his forearm, redirecting the force without resistance. The next strike followed instantly, a crescent kick arcing toward Cain's ribs. Cain dropped low, pivoting on the balls of his feet, slipping inside the attack. His palms shot upward in a sharp vertical thrust, stopping just shy of the student's exposed chin, a classic Yurikan technique, restrained but deliberate. It felt natural. Too natural. Frustration darkened the student's expression. His strikes became broader, heavier, abandoning form in favor of brute force. Cain saw it clearly, the tensing of the jaw, the over-rotation of the shoulders, the faltering footwork. Every overextended strike revealed another gap. Cain capitalized. As the student lunged with a wild hook, Cain's eyes caught the overextension in his opponent's shoulder. He pivoted smoothly, raising his forearm to intercept the strike, guiding the punch harmlessly past him. Without hesitation, Cain shifted his weight forward, stepping in close. His foot slid behind the student's heel in a swift, hooking motion, and with a subtle twist of his hips, he swept the leg out from under him. The student's balance crumbled, and he crashed to the mat with a heavy thud, the impact reverberating through the silent dojo. Cain exhaled slowly, shifting back into a relaxed stance. His muscles burned, the fatigue of the prior night's mental link still a drain deep within him, but his movements remained fluid and controlled. The student glared up at him, chest heaving, face flushed with frustration. Around them, a few reluctant claps rippled through the tension. Cain didn't acknowledge them. He hadn't been fighting for their approval. Across the mat, Hoshizawa's expression remained unreadable, though something darker flickered in his eyes, a glint of cold calculation. To Hoshizawa's eyes alone, the air around Cain rippled faintly, dark tendrils of shadow weaving through the space around him. They moved with an unsettling rhythm, coiling and uncoiling with each breath Cain took, as if mirroring his pulse. Each precise strike, each calculated step had sent those dark wisps slithering outward, not wildly, but with purpose. The shadows didn't lash out, they moved as if guided by an unseen hand, wrapping around Cain in a pattern too deliberate to be chance. It wasn't mindless. It wasn't entirely his either. Symbiotic? Hoshizawa's curiosity deepened, his analytical mind piecing together the possibilities. Was Cain controlling it, or was it adapting to him? The tendrils seemed to hesitate at times, as if waiting for Cain's intent before moving. And yet, when Cain faltered for a brief second, they pressed on without him. Hoshizawa's arms tightened across his chest, his expression unreadable. This was no ordinary aura, no simple manifestation of latent energy. This was something older, something that watched and listened. The Shihan's lips pressed into a thin line. What are you? His gaze drifted from Cain back to his own hand. Slowly, Hoshizawa lifted it into view, studying it with detached curiosity. Wisps of faint gray mist curled lazily from his fingertips, thin, insubstantial, yet undeniably real. The tendrils moved as if stirred by some invisible breeze, coiling and unraveling in response to his breath. For a moment, he simply watched. Then, softer, more to himself than before, he murmured, "What are we?" Cain turned slightly, catching the faint murmur of a whisper, but missing its weight. A fleeting thought passed through him, a hollow sensation tugging at his chest. The eyes on him now weren't just jealous. They were wary.